Take your Bible, if you would, and open it to Daniel chapter 8. If I get the mic back in place, we'll be ready to go. Daniel chapter 8 will be our study tonight, and I do appreciate so much your presence here this evening. It's encouraging to be together with God's people. It's, as we think about truly wanting to live upon higher ground, these are the kinds of times that help us to do that. The world is discouraging to those who are Christians. It would drag us down, but being together, singing these songs together, praying together, and hopefully to study together, help us all to press toward the higher ground. We're talking today about what is often called the years of silence. Some people refer to it as the intertestamental period, but I think I like the term years of silence for this reason. One is it's a little easier to pronounce when you're up in front of people, but secondly, though, it is a time when God had ceased to speak to the people through the prophets. He had been speaking to them through the years, and he'd said all he had to say. And it was time to wait for the coming of the Christ. But my title is He Spoke on the Years of Silence. He said some things in the prophets, especially in Daniel, that were fulfilled during those years of silence. And I think it can help to strengthen our faith when we see that, to see the God who's in control of things and help us better understand the world that is the New Testament world. In the book of Daniel, in the first chapter, Daniel and his friends have been taken into captivity. And if you've studied that period of history, you'll remember that the captivity took place in three waves. The first wave that took Daniel and his friends was a relatively small group of captives, primarily some of the select young men of the place. And Daniel was one of those. But while Daniel is in captivity with the Babylonians, he interprets a dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Then he's also shown a vision in chapter 7 where he sees the three kingdoms that would follow. The third of those, which would be the fourth in total, is not identified, but the other two are. He was told that Medo-Persia would come next, and they came during his lifetime. In fact, he would serve under the Persians. It is under the Persian Empire that he's cast into the lion's den. But it would be long after the death of Daniel before the Greeks would come to power. But God showed him that. And then he showed him that after that, there would be another one. But before that, we think about Alexander. And by the way, that is a picture of him. I think I identified who the picture was. That's not me on a bad day. That's Alexander the Great. And he, as he conquered territory ranging from Greece all the way over to what we would call India today, the border of it, he spread the Greek language. The Old Testament translation that Jesus and the apostles used most of the time was the Septuagint, the LXX, and that was done because of Alexander's conquest. And it gave us the language of the New Testament. Well, what I want to do tonight is talk about briefly the last 140 years or so of the Greek rule and then introduce that fourth kingdom. But if you got your Bible open to Daniel 8, let's look at verses 5 through 8 again. And as I was considering, he's already spoken of the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. Then he said, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, as I said this morning, Alexander, it was just remarkable how quickly he conquered the world. I mean, so much of that part of the world. He became king at age of 20, died at age 33. But he conquered all this territory and did so much that would contribute to what we call Western civilization today. But I like to say sometimes Alexander was great until he wasn't. You know, he was a man who drank to excess. His lifestyle was immoral and ungodly in so many ways. And at 33 he dies, as it would say here. And this is long before it happens. This is 200 years before it would happen. Daniel sees that the large horn was broken. At age 33, this king dies, and what happens? His kingdom breaks up into these various parts. I can't help but think about a contrast with someone else who died at the age of 33. And his death established his kingdom that would last forever. Alexander dies, and yes, the Greek influence would live on and still does today. But his kingdom splinters. Jesus dies to establish his kingdom. But among those that were taking part, and it took a little while for all this to shake out, but a man named Seleucus, he is given control of, at various times, all this territory. And then a general named Ptolemy has the portion of Egypt. And for about 100 years, the Jews of Judea were under the jurisdiction of the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers of Egypt. I mentioned this morning, Cleopatra, we run into, everybody's seen her in movies or, things. She was a Greek. She's not a native Egyptian. She was part of that Greek family as she ruled. But they were pretty tolerant of the Jews. And then about 198 BC, the Seleucid Empire took control of Palestine. And things would soon change. Antiochus III wasn't so bad, but his son, who came to the throne about 175, Antiochus Epiphanes, I am convinced, is the little horn of verse 9. Daniel 8, verse 9. And out of one of them, remember the horns that came from Daniel, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all of this, and he prospered. Drop down to verse 23. God's explaining what Daniel's seen. He said, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise having fierce features. He's explaining this little horn, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. All of that to say, Daniel foresaw the coming of a man that was going to fight against the people of God. And eventually, God would cause him to be overthrown. Well, this Antiochus Epiphanes, what he wanted the Jews to do is to become Greeks. He wanted them to assimilate. We could get into all kinds of reasons why he wanted to really unify his kingdom for various reasons. He wanted them to give up their unique ways, to forsake the customs of the Jews. He wanted them to participate in the athletics that the Greeks did, which they did in the nude, to go to the gyms and such. In every way, he wanted them to become Greeks. God wanted his people to be a holy people. I think there's a tendency in every generation. We look at things and we think there was some ideal past where God's people didn't face any pressures. Yeah, there are times it may be greater than others. But God's people have always faced pressures. Pressures to conform to the world around them. As I talked about last Sunday evening, Jesus said, Paul said, do not be conformed to this world. There's always that pressure. That pressure was great. And this man, he was a terrible man. He came along and he shut down the daily sacrifices in Jerusalem, offered a hog on the altar. Swine were unclean animals. The only animals to be offered in sacrifice, they were to be unclean, they were to be clean, they were to be unblemished. You gave your best. Antiochus Epiphanes, and by the way, the name Epiphanes, and epiphany is an appearance, a manifestation. He was the manifestation of Zeus. It reminds me a bit of the old Japanese emperors like Hirohito that were supposed to be, deity was in them, the pharaohs of Egypt. He was the manifestation of Zeus. He offers this sacrifice, and I might just say, during this time, as God's people are being tested, there were some who really stood out for their opposition. And they were sometimes referred to as the pious ones. And they are believed to be the ancestors of the Pharisees. Not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense. But then this is when it really got interesting. They went to a little town called Modin, and I don't know how well you can see the circle right here. A little small village. But there was a priest there named Mattathias Hasmoneus. And the Syrian officials, they're Seleucids, they are Greek, but they ordered him to offer incense to Zeus. If the priest does it, then it's okay, right? They tell the priest, you're to offer incense. He refused to do it. He firmly said he would not do it. And so they found another Jew that said, well, I'll do it. Before he could offer the incense, Mattathias Hasmoneus killed that Jew, and he and his sons killed all the Syrian officials, and then they fled for the hills. And Mattathias, who would not live too long after this, he and his sons then launched a guerrilla war against all of this. And he initially had his son Judas Maccabeus, was the nickname given to him, to be his military leader. You've probably heard this referred to as the Maccabean Revolt. And in fact, people will talk about the Maccabeans. Technically, we should not say the Maccabeans, it's the Hasmoneans. That's the family name. Maccabeus was a nickname. It meant the hammer. You know, Judas was the kind of guy that could drop the hammer on you. And I think we all know what that means. He was tough. He was good. You could tell many stories about them. Look at Daniel 11 in verse 32. Daniel 11 is a detailed prophecy about things that go on between the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and it involving God's people. But in verse 31, it's speaking of the same period of history. It says, "And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits." There were those who went along with Antiochus, that went along with the ways of conformity, and they compromised the covenant. But there were also those, he said, who knew their God. And he said they will be strong, and they would carry out great things. Sometime read stories about the Maccabean revolt. Against what would seem like insurmountable odds, they were able to win their freedom. They were able, it went back and forth, of course, but in December of 164 BC, they recaptured Jerusalem. Just one New Testament reference. Look at John, the 10th chapter. In verse 22, it says, and this is in the life of Jesus, "Now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter." Well, in the Old Testament, we don't have any feasts that fall in the winter. But I think everybody here knows the Jews have one today that falls in December that they call Hanukkah. That's the feast he's talking about here. It's today known as Hanukkah. It is a celebration of their recapture of Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple, and the reinstatement of the sacrifices. That's where that feast day, that's where that holiday today came from. They continued to fight, and finally in 142, they gained their independence. They were able to throw off the rule of the Seleucids, that Greek empire. And there would be some times, maybe, things wouldn't be quite as good, but they had their independence. And a few years after this, there was a man named John Hyrcanus, one of the Hasmoneans, who defeats the Samaritans, and right here's Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans had built a temple up there. John 4 tells about Jesus talking with the woman at the well. And she said, "Our fathers say this is the mountain you worship on." And they were talking about Mount Gerizim. But he tore down that temple. He destroyed it. Down here you've got Idumea, which that's the Greek way of saying Edom. I like the old way better, but Hyrcanus, he was able to not only gain independence from the Seleucids, he brings the Samaritans, he brings the Idumeans into his reign, under his control. They were strong. And most historians believe that it's about this time that the Pharisees and the Sadducees began to really crystallize. The Pharisees were those who opposed the compromises with idolatry, with the worldly ways. The Sadducees were a little more of had a little more political orientation in their view of things. Well, we'll leave them because we've got to get to the legs of iron. we've got to talk about the Romans. Go back to Daniel 2, and let's remind ourselves what was seen. Now, if you're really interested in history and you want to look it all up, there were a lot of things that went on between the Romans as they are starting their push to the east. Conflicts between the Seleucids. The Seleucids had surrendered territory long before we are really concerned about it, but that doesn't touch on the biblical story as much. But in Daniel chapter 2, in verse 32, this image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together, became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And then, verse 44. In these days, the days of these kings, the Roman kings, he said, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. I want you to turn to Daniel 7. We didn't look at it this morning. But notice in this one, he portrays Rome in a different way. Rome, and now it's never identified by name in Daniel, but history clearly reveals it to be the successor to Greece. In chapter 2, it's iron. It focuses on its strength. It also talks a little bit about the fragility of the kingdom in that, there was iron mixed with clay. But chapter 7 depicts it as the beast. And it talks about it, some of the persecution it would inflict. But that's not for this lesson, really. That's for the book of Revelation. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. You come on down to verse 17. He said, those great beasts, which are 4 kings, and the margin says as kingdoms, which arise out of the earth. The Roman kingdom here, this 4th one, is portrayed as bad and vicious. And that's what we begin to see toward the end of the New Testament. But I want to talk about it in the time before the New Testament. Rome, it had been growing in power for some years. If you want to study history, you can read about what they call the Punic Wars with Carthage in North Africa. And Hannibal and his war elephants that he brought from Africa, and they went through the northern Alps of Italy and all. Fascinating stories. But see, none of that really touches on the biblical story. When it begins to impact the Bible story is about 64, 63 BC, when a Roman general named Pompey, who had been given authority, he was supposed to stop piracy along the Mediterranean. So he's marching around the Mediterranean coast, and he enters Jerusalem and forces Jerusalem to become subject to Rome. And you know how history is, how things come and they go. Rome has control of Jerusalem for a little while, and then they didn't. Parthia, which is off to its east, they enter into Jerusalem, and they take control of it. And by the way, if you're looking at this map, you can't see the code. Everything in the darker colors belonged to Rome by the time of the New Testament. It just shows the stages at which it was taken. But the Parthians, Acts 2 verse 9, there were Parthians at Jerusalem on Pentecost. But they take control of it. And then a man named Herod, we've all heard of him, Herod the Great, he says to the Romans, I would like to be king over Judea. Herod was an Idumean, an Edomite. But he was, John Hyrcanus had forced them to submit to the law. He was at least what we'd call a nominal Jew, being proselyted. His father had had great political power. And so the Caesars said, okay, here's the deal. If you can get an army, got to raise up your own army, and you can evict the Parthians from Jerusalem, then we'll make you the king. And he did. In 37 BC, he is able to evict the Parthians. He retook it, and the city of Jerusalem became theirs. When the New Testament opens, in Luke chapter 1, when the angel appears to Zacharias, who all is in charge? Well, there was Herod, king of the Jews. When the Old Testament ended, there was no king. When the New Testament is beginning to unfold its story, we have an Edomite who is serving as king of the Jews. In some ways, it was called Herod the Great. He was a builder. He built the city of Caesarea, an artificial harbor at Caesarea. Israel never had a good harbor. Joppa was not a good harbor. Caesarea was. He built that. He built a lot of things. He was also a very wicked man, cruel man. And he went outside of Jerusalem and the confines of Judea, he would build temples to idols, though he wouldn't do that in Jerusalem. When you read about Herod issuing an order to have all the babies killed in Bethlehem, those 2 years and under, it's very believable. There was an expression, it was said about Herod the Great. It was kind of a joking but dark humor. Said it was better to be Herod's hog than to be his son. And the humor in it was that the Greek word for son and the Greek word for hog sound almost alike. Now, some of you may have had teenage boys whose bedrooms made you think there's a lot of truth there, But, the word hog and son sounded a lot like, just one letter's different. And as a so-called pretending at least to be a Jew, he wouldn't have killed a hog. But he killed more than one son because he saw him as a threat to his power. That's the kind of man that he was. Well, That brings us to the end of the years of silence. In Galatians, the 4th chapter, in verse 4, it speaks of Jesus in this way. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. What does the fullness of the time mean? Well, I think most directly, it was the fact that God said it would happen in the days of this fourth kingdom. That this, it wasn't going to happen during the Babylonian or the Medo-Persian or the Greek, but that fourth kingdom, in those days he would come. But I also, and this is, I'll tell you right off, this is supposition, but knowing the providence of God, it was a time when one language was widely spoken. Not everybody spoke Greek. And it's interesting, the Romans, Latin was their language. But Greek remained the predominant language. There was what some called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The area around the Mediterranean was largely peaceful. There were exceptions, but largely peaceful. The Romans built a highway system. Now, they wouldn't be highways like we would think of today for driving cars on. But transportation, even with its challenges, was better than it had ever been before. And into that world, Jesus came, died, and then told his apostles, he said, you go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. You go make disciples of all the nations. I don't think there was a time before he came that would have been better for it, where you would have had the roads, the language, the peace that allowed all of that. God foretold much of it. And then God also was working in his great providence. In this, I've tried to resist the temptation to get into the weeds too much and tell a lot of stories that are unrelated to the Bible account. There's some fascinating things that happened. But the thing that to me is most impressive is to realize that God knows what's going to happen. And God can make the future work for his people. We need to be a people who pray. Pray to the God who is in charge, who is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And we need to trust him. We need to trust him. I mentioned in the time leading up to the Maccabean revolt, there were those who went along, who would conform, because these are the powers that be. Always remember, there is a power that will always be, that's far greater than any of the powers of this world. Kingdoms do rise and fall. Think about the great Babylonian Empire, the head of gold, that lasted less than 100 years. The Roman Empire would last a lot longer than that, but it would break up, be destroyed. Kingdoms rise and fall, but this world can't be our home. Let's make sure we're part of that kingdom that Daniel says will endure. Daniel 2, in verse 44, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Don't you want to be a part of that kingdom? This evening, if you're not a Christian, when we sing this song of invitation, why don't you let us know of your desire to be a child of God, a citizen of the kingdom, a subject of the king, but also a child of the King, an heir to this great inheritance. If you need to be baptized into Christ or you need our prayers, why don't you come while we stand and we sing together?